Americans like to think that a person like Adolf Hitler, who preached nationalism at the exclusion of groups of people, could never rise in prominence in our country. They believe that our principles of freedom will always protect life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that an absolutist regime could never rise to destroy these principles. A deeper look at the 1930s and the presence of organizations like the German-American Bund that espoused anti-Semitic ideals reveals that it almost happened then. And if the last 6 years have taught us anything, we should realize that it could happen here again. We as a society need to watch for the signs, the dangers to our democratic republic, including the distortion of historical facts and the ability of charismatic speakers to rally public support and demand loyalty to the point of attacking people and institutions deemed as threats to their own way of life. And the picture that I have here on my title page is a German-American Bund rally at Madison Square Garden, which of course is not in Nuremberg or in Berlin, but in New York, United States of America, okay? These are Americans. The people who are saluting are also Americans, okay? So this has happened here before. A quick word on my sources. We always try to find all the information available that is out there. And these guys were not a secret. The newspapers were full with their activities, and the majority of my sources comes from newspapers, national newspapers, as well as Missouri newspapers. There are also several published histories of the national German-American Bund, but nothing yet on the Missouri German-American Bund. And there are sources in St. Louis at the Jewish Federation. However, right now, these sources are boxed up because they're all moving to the new Kaplan-Feldman Holocaust Museum that will be opening up in November. So the timing was a little off this year, but I plan to go there later this year and do some more research. So let me begin with a little bit of context. What was the time period during which the German-American Bund formed? This is right after World War I. World War I is a time period in American history when German Americans come under attack. It's a time period when there's a heightened anti-German sentiment, not just against the German enemy overseas, but also against German Americans here. And while most German Americans who had lived in the United States for 3-4 generations were already more American than Germans, the impact of World War I was more about accelerating assimilation and adjustment to the American way of life than anything. However, we also had German immigrants living in the United States during World War I who had not yet become naturalized citizens. And these immigrants had to register as alien enemies. And having been registered as an alien enemy could result in you losing your job, you losing your apartment, and really being treated worse than the old stock German Americans who've been living here for generations. And it is those German immigrants who had to register as enemy aliens who begin this movement that eventually morphs into this American Nazi movement, okay? So they combined these German immigrants who had to register as enemy aliens. They then combined with German immigrants who come from Germany to the United States in the 1920s. Why do we have German immigrants coming to the United States in the 1920s? Well, because the German economy after World War I was not worth a penny. They were disillusioned about the war, the outcome of the war, you know, why did Germany lose, and so on. And it's these two groups of disillusioned individuals who now begin to join organizations that eventually will become the German-American Bund. We also have the Great Depression beginning in 1929. And to these disillusioned individuals, the Great Depression only confirmed that democracy and capitalism does not work, okay? So, but they stay around. They stay in the United States. They don't leave because initially, Germany is just as bad off as the United States is during the Great Depression, right? But then we also have German propaganda activities in the United States happening. And they do this through the Deutsches Ausland Institute, the DAI. And they are spreading their propaganda quite effectively in the United States. They make the argument that a German is always a German, always will be German, that you cannot really become Americanized. They make an appeal to these German immigrants, whether they have become citizens or not, as well as try to appeal to old stock German Americans that, you know, this new Germany in the 1930s is doing great things. And the only reason why it is doing great things is because it has great leadership, right? So the propaganda machine here in the United States, financed by Germany through the consulates. I mean, they have, what is it called? Diplomatic immunity, right? And they have bank accounts in the United States, so they can publish that propaganda, okay? And Hermann Goering in 1937 says, Germans in the United States need to be organized, because if Germany, this is 1937, if Germany should again go to war with France and England, there would come a moment when the United States might consider entering such a war. And the groups of organized Germans might throw their influence decisively against a declaration of war and prevent the United States from entering such a conflict. So there was a purpose. Clearly, they were already thinking in 1937, there might be a war in the future, right? And there were a number of, and I could give a separate presentation just over that, but I'll give just one example of people living in the United States, totally working this propaganda machine in the United States. And one of them was George Sylvester Viereck, and he's the publisher of a German language newspaper in New York City. He comes from Munich, has lived in the United States for 40 years by the time the 1930s come around. He's a poet, he's a freelance writer, he's a journalist. He was an outspoken opponent to war in World War I, almost was charged under the Espionage Act, but wiggled out of that. He becomes actually a paid German agent during World War II. But prior to World War II, he uses the United States government to spread his message. And how does he do that? He infiltrates Congress. He works with isolationists, people in Congress, our representatives, who believe that we should be supporting Germany instead of being opposed to Germany, that we should not get involved in any military conflict, that we should stay out of European affairs. And he, for example, Mr. Viereck would be working for Senator Ernst Lundin, a Republican from Minnesota. He would be working with Representative Hamilton Fish, a Republican from New York. And how would he be using his influence with these people? He would use their franking privileges. Every member of Congress has franking privileges on how they can send out information to their constituents. So Viereck got all the addresses of all the constituents of these members of Congress. And what would he do? He would mail out pro-German, anti-war, isolationist, anti-Jewish, anti-communist literature to all those constituents. And the taxpayers paid for it, right? That's how the German government was able to infiltrate our government and spread that pro-German, anti-war, pro-isolationist ideology. He eventually, they were able to arrest him because he failed to register as a foreign agent. There was really nothing else they could do about this, right? There are no laws that prohibit the mailing of information, right? Right? So he's an example of how well that political machine, actually, that propaganda machine worked. But now to the German-American Bund. The German-American Bund initially begins in 1918 as an association that calls itself Americans of Teutonic Heritage. These are German immigrants who had to register as enemy aliens during World War I. And they begin to unite with German immigrants who come in the 1920s, and then they morph into this Free Society of Teutonia. Okay, they meet, they celebrate German things, they sing German songs, they make themselves feel good, and have a grand old time. Then by the early 1930s, they again transition into the Friends of New Germany. And they're actually encouraged to do this by the Deputy Führer in Germany, so the second to Adolf Hitler, and he was Rudolf Hess. You may have heard his name before, okay? So the Friends of New Germany is fully supported by Germany itself. They're being advertised in Germany. They're getting support here in the United States. They have rallies. And while the two previous organizations are strictly limited to a chapter in New York City, the Friends of New Germany now spread westward. You have a chapter in Chicago, for example, and you have a chapter in St. Louis, Missouri, okay? But their activities, because they too start mailing propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, anti-communist propaganda, pro-isolationist, anti-war propaganda, and they now begin to get the attention of Congressman Samuel Dickstein, who's from New York, and this now leads in the House of Representatives to the creation of the Special Committee on American Activities authorized to investigate National Socialist propaganda. I mean, those are government names and agencies, right? This would soon become known as the Dees Committee after its chairman, Martin Dees. He's an isolationist from Texas who feared that, quote, treason from within was being aided by invasion from without, unquote. So he's looking at these German immigrants who are members of the Friends of New Germany, who are making these arguments. Look at how great Adolf Hitler is. The Germans are out of the Great Depression by 1935, right? So great leadership can have great results. This is what they're arguing. They're also arguing that who caused the Great Depression? It's Jewish bankers who are in cahoots, supposedly, with communists who are aiming to ruin all the major countries economically and then take over the world. Of course, these are false narratives, right? But the members of the Friends of New Germany are eating this up, right? And they're trying to disseminate this information elsewhere. But when Rudolf Hess begins to realize there's a congressional investigation going in, soon to be hearings to be happening, Rudolf Hess says, no, we're removing ourselves from the Friends of New Germany. He calls for their disbandment and says no more support for Germany proper. But the guys say, hey, we're doing fun things. We're doing great things here in the United States. So they don't go away. They don't listen to Hess. And instead, Fritz Julius Kuhn, who is referred to in the press as the American Führer, now turns the Friends into the American Bund. And under his leadership, it becomes a national organization with chapters in the Northeast, throughout the Midwest, and even as far as California out on the West Coast of the United States. So they're beginning to spread rather quickly. And now some of the images that I'm going to show you might be a little disturbing, but they're the truth. Bund members regularly marched through towns, held summer camps for drilling, training, education in National Socialism, and for family vacations. This is an image from Camp Nordland in Sussex Hills, New Jersey. There was also a Camp Siegfried in Yamphank, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, New York, and a Camp General von Steuben in Connecticut. And there was a camp in St. Louis, but I'll get to it in a few minutes, okay? During summer camps, youth, both boys and girls, were indoctrinated into National Socialism in similar fashion as the Hitler Youth in Germany. And German Americans in the United States have had a long-standing habit of celebrating German Day. They're celebrating the German contributions to the United States, be it in the American Revolution, be it during the American Civil War, and they have yearly parades. And every major city has a federation of German societies, and they would put up these parades, these celebrations. And initially, when the German Bund was created in 35, you would have them participating in these parades. So you see the German American Bund with their band and their members flying both the American flag and the swastika right next to it. And they're parading down the streets. This is New York City. This is not a secret organization. Everybody sees them. Everybody knows about them, right? And nobody's saying stop. And here is Fritz Kuhn addressing a Bund meeting out in California at Hindenburg Park in La Crescenta, which is near Los Angeles, on April 30th, 1939. Now, there's an interesting story about these guys in uniform. White shirts, black pants, black tie, black semi belt, and they were called an honor guard or the ushers at all these meetings. But in actuality, they were called the Oberdienst or the OD, and were very similar in actions as to stormtroopers. They were there to keep law and order during any and all meetings, okay? Now, the apex of the National Bund came on February the 20th, 1939, when it held a rally at Madison Square Garden. More than 20,000 individuals attended that meeting. In the rows, you have the uniformed Oberdienst, the guys that I was just referring to, maintaining law and order. It was a spectacle which remained etched in the memories of those who attended. It was an evening of American patriotism and Germanness, but also an evening of isolationism and America first, of rabid racism and anti-Semitism. Waves of thunderous applause followed each tirade from the podium. One could have thought that one was at a rally in Nuremberg, Germany. At the center is a large portrait of George Washington, flanked by American flags, as well as the swastika phoenix. Why? Was the Bund celebrating George Washington? They claimed him as their icon. They called him the first fascist. And they made the argument that he supposedly knew democracy could not work. Why would they think this? They were mentioning things that he was very influential, supposedly, which wasn't, in the drafting of the American Constitution, which really did not create a democratic society, but limited the power of the ordinary people by not directly electing back then the United States Senate and not directly electing the President of the United States. They also noted his reaction to the Whiskey Rebellion. He gets on the horse. He leads the militia to put down that rebellion by the common ordinary farmers, right? So that's why the Bund is making the argument that he was the first fascist who understood that democracy would not work. But enough. Well, wait a minute. Yeah. While those guys were speaking inside, were expressing their freedom of speech under the First Amendment, those who were opposed to them could not, and were deferred to make their speeches and addresses on the outside, right? And you have New York's finest on horses or on foot, making sure that these guys would not go inside Madison Square Garden. So they're keeping law and order, right? But clearly it's one group who clearly has the freedom of speech, whereas the other side is not being heard, right? Here is Fritz Kuhn at the podium. And every time he says something about the Jews and bankers and communists and how they're trying to ruin the United States, huge applause. And as he is launching into one of his anti-Jewish tirades, a young Jewish man rushed the stage. But the ushers, well, no, really the OD, very quickly captured him. And police had to rescue him from the ushers. And eventually police identified the person as Isidor Greenbaum, 26, a hotel worker, a Jewish individual who wanted to express his freedom of speech too by stopping Fritz Kuhn from talking. But Mr. Kuhn remained on the rostrum and was able to finish his speech. More about him and his future in a little bit. I want to move on to Missouri. Context. Missouri in the 1930s. You have a large number of German Americans. They still speak German. They even still read 2 German language newspapers in St. Louis, okay? And these German language newspapers advertise the Friends of the New Germany, Freunde des Neuen Deutschlands, okay? And they're watching a movie. Tonfilm means a movie with sound. So it's a German movie with sound. And it's the movie about Horst Wessel. He's an individual, he's an SS person who was killed in 1930 and became a martyr in the cause of Nazism, okay? So they're showing those kinds of movies in St. Louis. And I have not yet found any information how many people actually go there and watch it, but it's being advertised, right? So it's not a secret. So as elsewhere in the county, St. Louis also had a chapter of the Friends of New Germany. I already said everything else. Okay. And the leader of the St. Louis chapter is Albert Miller. I found a photograph of him. He was born in 1905 in Frankfurt, Germany. He arrived as a young teenager in 1921 with his mother, and his father followed in 1922. He's a very intelligent, bright young man. One newspaper article noted that he received a full scholarship from Washington University, in part because he had graduated from high school in 2.5 years. He came to the United States only speaking German. He graduated from an American high school in 2.5 years. He was very dedicated to his studies. He learned English very quickly. And what he loved to do was read books. And the reporter asked him, well, don't you like girls? No, I want to read books. And even though he got the scholarship from Washington University in St. Louis, he never used it. Instead, he had a dream. And that dream led him to somewhere else. From where did he graduate? Missouri School of Mines in 1929, because his dream was to become a mining engineer. I was totally blown away when I found that newspaper article. So thank you, Debbie, for helping me find more information. And this is actually a photograph from the yearbook, the year that he graduated. I'm still trying to get into his head, figure out why this young gentleman, who in my opinion was living the American dream, would be enamored by National Socialism and would be advocating, to any newspaper articles, when he's being interviewed and being quoted in the newspaper, he appears to be like hero worship of Adolf Hitler, right? So I'm still trying to get there. In the 1930 census, he's identified as being a naturalized citizen. I only can find his intent of becoming a citizen, not the actual citizenship certificate. In 1930 census, he was unemployed, but his father was fully employed. Then in 1931 and 1935 city directories, I see him being employed as an engineer in an engineering company in St. Louis. So he must not have suffered as much as like a quarter of the population that had no jobs. I don't know if he was part-time employed. That could have been a problem, but we're still digging, right? So he's the leader, and St. Louisans really become aware of this organization in 1937 as newspaper articles begin to publish when they're meeting, what they're talking about, and so on. And these guys don't hold back. They freely share their ideology, their opinions, and everything else. So this is an April 1937 St. Louis Post-Dispatch article. And it talks about a meeting in April 1937 by the Bund. Here it is referred to as the St. Louis branch of the German American People's League, but it really is a German American Bund. And they meet in particular to oppose New York Mayor LaGuardia. If anybody knows anything about LaGuardia in the 1930s, he was totally anti-Hitler, and he didn't stop at denouncing Hitler left and right, right?
He read the funnies to the children in the paper strike.
Right. So they are meeting to express their opposition to Mayor LaGuardia. They also opposed Congressman Dick Stein, who had called for the investigation in Congress. And but the problem is, as the newspaper is pointing out, as they're meeting, they're also handing out anti-communist and anti-Jewish literature. There is and they meet in the German House in St. Louis. The German House is the center of the Federation of German American Associations. The Liederkranz, that is a choir, will be meeting there. You have other German American societies meeting there. There's a total of 26 German American societies who regularly meet at the German House. And now these guys also meet there. And this is becoming a problem here in a little bit. So there is an American flag on one side of the stage, the Nazi flag on the other side of the stage. Albert Müller, to whom I have introduced you, spoke in English, arguing that the organization was formed by people who would not tolerate attacks on a great man like Adolf Hitler and on the German people in general. He asserted that the group was misrepresented in the press and incorrectly labeled as American Nazis. He stated that we're not Nazis. All we want is to preserve the achievements of our forefathers. It takes nerve to belong to our league, because many of us might be economically boycotted. Anton Kessler, who is the leader of the Oberdienst in St. Louis, while wearing his uniform of black pants, white shirt, black ties, black Sam Brown belt, then addressed the audience of about 100 in German, praising Hitler and his building up of Germany. Kessler proceeded to attack union leaders, how they were thrown out of Germany and how they should be thrown out of the United States as well. He denounced New York Mayor LaGuardia as a half Jew, half Italian. Well, he was, but he denounced him, saying that because he had that mixed in heritage, he should have never been allowed to come to the United States. Kessler concluded with an attack on communists and their red rag. And then Müller went back on stage and led the audience in 3 thundering howls for German American harmony. Not German American with a hyphen in between, but German meaning Germany and American, the United States, harmony between the two countries. Within days, the newspapers announced that the St. Louis Bund has also opened a summer camp called Deutsch Horst. Deutsch means, of course, German. Horst, if you go into the dictionary, tells you it's a nest. Well, no, not really. It's not like a little bird's nest or a chicken's nest. A horst is more like an eagle's nest. Anybody got that connotation? Yep. This Deutsch Horst was located south of St. Louis on the Merrimack River near LeMay Ferry, alongside other riverfront vacation or summer homes. The Bund also purchased a meeting hall on Oregon Avenue in St. Louis and referred to it as the headquarters of defense for American democracy. Anton Kessler, the ODE chief, told the newspaper that enrollment in the Bund was about 100. In my personal opinion, that is fairly small for the large German American population in St. Louis. Only 100 individuals joined that organization. Kessler argued that the organization stressed German culture, but also intended to uphold the US Constitution. 2 main aspects of the organization's platform were opposition to communism and opposition to the Jewish American boycott against German-made goods. So it's Jewish Americans who boycott German-made goods, don't buy them here in the United States because of the Nuremberg laws that deny civil rights to Jews in Germany, okay? And these guys, Kessler and Miller, opposed that boycott. Kessler argued that he and other members were not opposed to Jews in general, just to their boycott. He noted that he had Jewish friends, but also stated that they could not join the Bund. That's kind of hypocritical, I think. Anyways, he insisted that the Bund has nothing whatever to do with the Nazi Party of Germany. He insisted the Bund was a purely American organization, limited to members who were citizens or who have applied for first citizenship papers. He described activities at the camp as singing of German folk songs and playing sports of all kinds, including baseball and horseshoe throwing. And there it is. This is the building. It's built on stilts because it's right next to the Merrimack River. What does the Merrimack River do every spring and early summer? Yeah, it goes over its banks and floods, right? There is 4 to 5 bedrooms in there. And on weekends, mostly on weekends, you have members coming there and, they're throwing balls and whatever. Because the river has nice, cool water, you can also put beer kegs in there and keep them cool for festivities on the weekend. Women are playing pinochle. And the only way you really know that this is a pro-Nazi organization is because there's a little flag on one of the desks on the inside of the house, not on the outside, on the inside, okay? But everybody knew that they were singing in German, that they were speaking in German. So these activities were happening. And again, thank you to newspapers, right? This is all known. This is not a secret. I mean, what was this, the Post-Dispatch? A lot of people subscribed to that at the time period. And then to the consternation of many St. Louisans, the German-American Bund participated in German Day activities that same August in 1937. So they just bought the camp and the building, and then they're participating in German Day activities. Most of the 26 German-American organizations that belong to the Federation of German Societies focused on preserving cultural habits. They were wearing their lederhosen, they were singing German songs, right? But what did the newspapers focus on? That 27th organization that participated in the events, right? Members who are stretching out their arms in salutes, right? And you can barely see it, but behind the American flag is a swastika flag, okay? So all of a sudden people are wondering what is going on? And this seemed to shock a great number of St. Louisans, and their reaction was swift in clear opposition to such activities, okay? Privately expressed, publicly expressed, but when it became clear that the Bund wanted to hold a national convention in St. Louis, nobody was talking about the economic impact if you bring all chapters from the Midwest to St. Louis. No. They were concerned what St. Louis would look like when all of a sudden all these swastika flags would be showing up, right? So people were outraged. Kessler keeps talking about the freedom of speech, that they have the right to hold that convention here, but you also have letters to the editor that are united in their opposition to A, issuing a permit for these Nazis, B, why would you defame the city of St. Louis by bringing the Nazis here, right? So they called it un-American behavior. They looked upon the flag as being offensive. But the Bund continued to plan its meeting. Then when the actual program was announced in the newspapers, almost all heck went loose. St. Louisans created the Council for American Democracy for the specific purpose of holding counter demonstrations to this proposed Nazi convention and to point out at our meeting the tenets of real Americanism in contrast to the foul, misleading, and subversive tenets of Nazism. So there's clear opposition to this. And the German House at this point in November of 1937 being inspired by all this opposition, makes it clear the Bund will no longer have access to the German house. So they are being shunned in St. Louis. In the end, it was private organizations rather than city leaders or the law that prevented the meeting from happening by denying the Bund a venue to hold the meeting. Allegedly, Kessler stated, "It's a disgrace to our country and to every red-blooded American." Sarcastically, he noted, so this is a free country and free speech. The editor found it amusing in this editorial that a supporter of Hitler would cry about free speech. And I find the last paragraph very interesting. This newspaper does not believe in suppression of thought or speech. It has no objection to Mr. Kessler holding a Nazi convention, but it is glad to know that the German Americans of St. Louis, as shown by their constant rebuffs of Nazis and Nazism, are distinctly not fertile soil for the machinations of Adolf Hitler's American agents. Okay, so clearly this organization is no longer welcome. And it is 1937, just as the St. Louis Bund seems to be at its apex with having gotten the camp and the building, that the whole situation begins to unravel. There's a report in the Daily Times of Chicago that is being reprinted throughout Midwestern newspapers, that the Chicago chapter of the Bund had been infiltrated. Yes, an American agent who took on a German identity, German name. He was fluent in German. So he joined that and he kept notes, all the things that they did. And then what did he do? He turned over all that information to the Dees Committee in Washington, D.C. And they were having a heyday, right? So from 1937 onward, you get regularly updates about the Dees Committee, the secrets supposedly that are being revealed. They weren't really secrets. Everybody knew about it if they just had read their newspapers, right? And other things. So the thing is, it's no longer just being investigated in Chicago, but very quickly, the St. Louis chapter will be investigated as well. And from this point onwards, the opponents of the German-American Bund also become more activated, more inspired to express their opposition. And every time there's a rally in St. Louis, there are more outside than there are inside. And every time one of the persons wants to come out, they're trying to attack them. In other words, who's being protected by the police? Not the opponents, but the members of the Bund. So when this guy, Fred Forster, left the meeting, somebody got close enough to him to knock off the hat, and he immediately screamed for help because he knew if they got closer to him, they might hurt him. Wilhelm Kunz, who's actually a speaker from the National Bund, German-American Bund, he had to sneak out the back of the building to get out of there so that he would not be hurt, right? So clearly, as the articles make clear, the Bund is not welcome in St. Louis. People are speaking out and it becomes a shunned organization. And indeed, the St. Louis chapter is being infiltrated as well by none other than the commander of the American Legion of Missouri, who happens to be a German American, who speaks German, okay? His name is Fred Botker. So he's a veteran, right? As a member of the American Legion, he's a veteran of World War I. And he infiltrates the organization. He too keeps notes and writes down names. And then he contacts the employers of all the individuals whose names he has written down. And he tells these employers what these guys are a member of, that they are a member of the Bund, that these are Nazis, and that they should be fired. And many a member of the Bund will be losing their jobs as a result of Butker's activities, okay? And by 1938, it looks like the Federation of German Societies might actually not hold a German Day, might not hold a picnic or anything, because they don't want to be associated with the swastika or anything. But in the end, they are not canceling the German Day celebrations, but they are prohibiting any Bund members to even come close to the German Day celebration. Okay, so clearly by December of 1938, the Bund chapter in St. Louis it still exists. They still meet on weekends in their camp house along the Merrimack River, but they're no longer marching in uniform. They don't hold any more rallies because they can't find a building to hold the rally in, except the building that they own, right? So totally shunned in the city of St. Louis. Fast forward to the following year, 1939. Remember in February of 1939, the big rally at Madison Square Garden? That was the finest, I call it the final rally that the Bund held. So they went out on top, more or less, right? Because very shortly, a few months later, here's Fritz Kuhn, gets arrested for embezzlement, gets convicted of embezzlement, and on December 6, 1939, with two other prisoners, enters the famous Sing Sing prison in New York. Okay, this is 1939. The war has broken out in Germany. It takes another, year and a half, my math might be off, almost 2 years before the United States enters the conflict, right, in 1941. The following year, he's stripped of his citizenship and he goes into a special camp for foreign enemies. Well, we had those during World War I and we had those during World War II, too, in case you didn't know. So he was in a federal camp in Texas as an enemy alien. In 1945, when the war is over, he gets deported to Germany, where he gets promptly arrested and placed into Dachau because he was a Nazi, right? And the American occupation forces put Nazis into prison. He eventually got out, but didn't live much longer thereafter. Anyway, so he got his. Here is a publication, also in 1939, of FBI investigation of the St. Louis Bund chapter. They're saying there's barely 80 members, since 1937. They're clearly making the argument that, yeah, there are a few OD members. There's 12 who are active, but 10 are way too old to even do anything. Camp Deutschhorst, that they actually revealed to the public that it is owned by 3 couples who hold joint trusteeship for all the members who had contributed to purchasing the house. So you may have contributed $10, you may have contributed $15, but they contributed the most. But still, you had access to the house because you contributed a small amount of money to that, right? And they made sure in this article, I guess to appease the readers, that whenever they were in camp at the building, that there were 2 flags, but the American flag was always on top, right? That the swastika flag never flew above the American flag. Shortly thereafter, after the revelation of this FBI report, several of the leaders actually leave St. Louis to go to Germany. And that includes Müller, who was the leader of the Bund, our graduate, and Kessler, the head of the OD. Now, the report in the newspaper explains that Müller had lost his job at the engineering firm of Russell and Axon because of his Bund activities. George Russell, president of the firm, told the Post-Dispatch reporter that Müller was given the choice of quitting the Bund or quitting his job. Müller allegedly stated that he thought he was doing a good job for the Bund. The engineering firm ordered him to make this choice because of that FBI report in the newspaper, right? So his name is mentioned in the FBI report. The employer's name is mentioned in the FBI report. And the employer says, you're either quitting the Bund or you're quitting your job, and Miller decided to quit his job. I have no idea what happened to him after he left for Germany. I guess I need to make a trip over there to maybe find out. But I found Kessler. And Kessler was a mayor in a French city during German occupation. Whoops, I'm standing in front of it. It didn't tell me what city it was. Or at least I can't see it on here anymore. I didn't write it down which one it was. And then everything suddenly comes to an end in St. Louis, rather suddenly, in September of 1939, right after Hitler invaded Poland. The St. Louis Bund had spent Labor Day weekend at the clubhouse, but the following day, the house burned to the ground. Neighbors saw the fire, but by the time the Melville Volunteer Fire Department arrived, all they could do was watch it burn and keep adjacent buildings from catching fire. I have no idea if they're doing this purposefully or not, okay? Firemen found in the ashes a 50-gallon drum, which had contained oil or some similar fuel. Window screens were found about 50 feet from the building, indicating there may have been an explosion. No one was ever charged for arson, and I have no idea if this was an inside job or if this was done by somebody on the outside who wanted to get even with it, right? While the Bund in St. Louis comes to an end, the National Bund comes to an end officially with Kuntz going to prison. That doesn't mean that there's an end of anti-Semitism or pro-Nazism in the United States. It just went underground, right? But members experienced long-term consequences. And again, an example from St. Louis. Once the United States is at war with Germany, and the Dees Committee still keeps digging into all these Bund activities in the United States. They find all these people who had been German immigrants, become naturalized Americans, but had also been Nazis, okay? And there was now a movement in the early 1940s to take their citizenship away, to no longer allow them to be American citizens, and in essence, to deport them out of the United States. And that is the faith of, what was his name? Did I write his name down? Robert Messon, who had come to the United States in 1926 and became a naturalized citizen in 1943. And as a result of the case against him in 1943, he was stripped of his American citizenship and he was deported, okay? So finally coming to the end. Phew. What's the significance of my talk? What's the significance of my presentation? Well, people have said it can never happen over here, right? Not here in the United States. We're the country of the free. This could never happen, right? Many went underground. And like I said, we still have anti-Semitic organizations around today. Again, where were you January 6th, right? Anyways, a charismatic leader can never rally enough people to an un-American cause. Surely we have laws that prevent this from happening, right? No, we don't really have the laws to keep people from expressing their freedom of speech, right? The only thing we can do is we can get them on taxes, we can get them on embezzlement, we can get them on failure to register as a foreign agent, right? But we don't limit the freedom of speech. And I'm not saying we should, right? Freedom of speech is one of our greatest freedoms that we have. It allows me to express this, right? So, but we need to pay attention to what's going on. We need to read the newspapers. Well, we don't read newspapers anymore, but we need to be aware of what is happening out there, right? And pay attention and not be silent, not be quiet. And then because if we are quiet, it can happen. And then all of a sudden it'll explode and then it'll be too late, right? Anyway, let me get off my soapbox. Quick few of the sources that I used. And thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Got a few from some of our Zoom people. So how, if at all, did the Bund affect life on college campuses in Missouri? Did college students support these organizations at Mizzou or Missouri S&T to your knowledge, or anything that you've found?
I have not found evidence on this campus, but I believe there were 2 members at Mizzou. Yep. But it's not widespread.
And they were Nazi German exchange students.
Oh, okay, so so if they're Nazi German exchange students, that would kind of explain why they might be doing that. But as far as, oh, it's in the display case back there, okay. But it's not a large university movement, as far as I know at this point.
Next question is, was there a German-American Bund activity in Kansas City as
Good question. I did not dig into the Kansas City newspapers. There might have been, I don't think there would have been, because there wouldn't have been a larger German-American population. It's St. Louis that attracted the German immigrants in the 1920s rather than Kansas City. I mean, I looked at the census, and of the 22,000 German immigrants who live in Missouri, 14,000 live in St. Louis. So, yeah.
You also had someone requesting to see your sources. You could flip back to that side.
Sure. These are not all, but
Hey, could I add something about Missouri School of Mines? It's not precisely in this period, but we had another Kessler come to the Missouri School of Mines in 1920, Harry Kessler. He was Jewish. And when he arrived at the Missouri School of Mines, he tried to find a place to live. He found out people in Rolla don't want a Jew living in their house. So the only way that he found a place to live was we had a professor of mathematics named George Dean. And he took all 4 Jewish students into his house. And Kessler said as he tried to learn about the other students, he discovered some of them thought Jews had horns coming out of their heads. So they'd never seen a Jew before. But he assimilated into the population of the campus. And it might have, I didn't know about Muir, but it might have made Muir feel comfortable because he's going to school in a community that's clearly anti-Semitic.
wow.
In one of your slides, when you were talking about the German nest, I saw there was a mention of the Turners. They weren't.
No. They clearly stated that they were not associated with the Turners. So yeah. They disassociated themselves from the Turners. Yeah, that was one of the few good things they said, honest things they said. So yeah.
We have another question. Were there any other cities that you know about in Missouri with Bund activities outside of St. Louis?
There was, I couldn't find, it was mentioned once that there was in Franklin County, that there was also a summer camp in Franklin County, but I could not find any other additional information that would back that up. And I don't trust just one source. I like at least 2. So I didn't want to put it in here, right? But I'll keep digging. Yes.
Since it's pretty clear that anti-Semitism was not limited to the German-American Bund, and I'm extrapolating here, but I'm assuming that many German Americans who did not become members of the Bund were still anti-Semitic. What prevented these people who shared a cornerstone of the philosophy of Nazism from becoming members of the Bund?
That's a very good question. And it's a fair question too. Perhaps the attention, because they may have been leaning, and clearly they allowed the German house to be used by the Bund, right? But once the Dies committee goes underway in 37, it seems like, no, we're not going to be associated with that, right? So it gives me a sense of they want to save their own back. They may have privately thought similarly, but they didn't express it publicly. Why not? Because of the experience of World War I, the anti-German sentiment that they had experienced then, because anybody who spoke out would be punished in one way or another. So I would think that by the 1930s, even though if they might have leaned that way to say, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't say anything, right? And not publicly support that. But they may have had a beer at the tavern and talked about similar ideology, right?
More questions from the computer.
Okay.
They've got some good ones over here. Could you comment on the parallels between the anti-Nazi efforts and the McCarthy era anti-communist efforts?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's a good question. The anti-Nazi efforts, of course, Dr. Greg will be talking about the anti-Nazi efforts too next week, right? The I can't really answer that question. No, I would have to think about that for a while. Yeah. Because anti-Nazi would mean the demonstrators against the Bund, right? But anti-communist, that is, what's his name with the piece of paper who said there are 2,000 employees in the State Department, right? So he got a lot of press, where in this case, the Bund got the press, whereas the anti-Nazis were in essence told, go home, don't cause any problems. And it's them that the police keeps out, right? So the press coverage is definitely different. Yeah.
Having mentioned that last thing about the ones the police kept out,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, apparently, these Nazi speakers had, free speech and been in the hall and everything. How do you think that it should have been handled where they were speaking in various places? But you mentioned that the police were protecting them.
Right. If you had the hall next door and let the opponents give their speeches, that would have been a nice thing to do, right? So you allow the Bund to do their speaking, and you in another hall you have the others speaking, right? What the police is trying to do is try to prevent fist fights, trying to prevent any violence from breaking out, right? So they're trying to maintain law and order, peace, right? Public safety.
So they did what you think would be a normal situation. I know there are campuses like out in California and various other places where conservative people are attacked and pushed out and forbidden to speak in college campuses.
They weren't forbidden to speak. They had their banners out there, right? They just were not allowed to go inside Madison Square Garden or inside any of the buildings where the Bund was meeting, right? If they wanted to go to another hall, they had the same freedom of speech to give their anti-Nazi expressions, right? It's just they can't do it right there in that building, right?
Yeah.
So because they want to maintain law and order and peace.
But here in these instances that I'm thinking of, the actual ones who had a platform, a legitimate platform, are heckled and allowed, they're not being protected as the Nazis were. So the free speech thing is now turned on its head.
In a way, it is turned on its head. Yeah. And I wonder how effective they would have been if they had rented a hall at the same day and given their speeches and got newspaper reporters there and made the front pages right next to the Bund making the front pages, right? That would have probably been the best approach to the whole thing. Yeah.
Was the Bund meeting in Madison Square Garden a ticketed event?
Where people would be paying entrance fees, you mean? I don't think they were paying entrance fees. I think you had to be a member of the Bund
So there
to get
there
in.
was a kind of gatekeeping function of those who could.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's the difference between an open lecture like this.
Right,
and
yeah,
gatekeeping.
yeah.
So I think that's apples and oranges. I don't think there's an apt comparison there.
Right. So it's members of the Bund who can come inside, and it's the OD that makes sure that you're showing your membership card, right? Yeah. Yeah.
More question. So the 22,000 German immigrants you were speaking to, were they not all not citizens?
There's no way that we know that.
Okay.
Whether it's 20,000 who were in Madison Square Gardens were citizens, native born, naturalized, or German immigrants. There's just no way of knowing because we don't have a list, or at least I don't have a list of who was actually there. I'd love to get my hands on the notes from the Dees Committee. Perhaps they have the list of names, but there was no way for me to do any of those long research trips during the last 4 months when I was first asked to come here and give a talk.
Next question. So what was your perception of the 1930s Bund and Richard Butler's Aryan Nations movement of the 1980s? We're going in depth here. We got it.
Again, I can't answer that because I have not done any research into the modern, what I call the modern present day, last 40, 50 years organizations.
How about this one? Okay. Excellent presentation from one of our
Thank you.
viewers. Many Missouri German Americans proudly served in the Civil War for the Union. Do you believe that this heritage inoculated the I think World War II generation of Missouri German Americans from Nazism?
To a certain degree, that would be true. Yes, absolutely. They fought in the Civil War. They made that argument even during World War I, when they were being heckled by Americans for still speaking German, still reading German language newspapers, when they were being attacked for still being German. It says, hey, we're as loyal as every American. We served in the American Civil War on the side of the Union. So that could be one additional factor of them not joining the German American Bund. But it doesn't mean they couldn't be convinced of that ideology, right? That in secret they might have. I mean, it goes, they were talking about the contributions of Germans to the United States, contribution of Germans to the world as a whole. There's evidence that they were reading poems by Goethe, by Schiller. I mean, every German American, regardless of what background, would have appreciated that, right? So it's possible that some were drawn in through that cultural reconnection with Germany. Yes.
I want to spin back just a second on the freedom of speech comment, because there's also a distinction here between what can occur freely in public and what can occur on private property or in private publications. You know, if you're on private property, if it's a private school, for example, they have control over what goes on that property. If it's a newspaper, even if it's a conservative paper or a liberal paper, they have control over what's published in that paper. So there's these, you know, when we talk about freedom of speech, there are these caveats that have to be considered in that conversation as well.
Absolutely. And the suggestions are that at Deutschhorst, their camp along the Merrimack River, they only talked in German. There were secret oaths that were given or taken, and that is the place where the kids really were indoctrinated into National Socialism. I hope I didn't come across as saying that this Bund was a fantastic organization, right? I would love to hear from people who may have had relatives in the organization. Okay, so like I said, this is 4 months of research, right? So I had known that the organization existed. I did not know there was a St. Louis chapter. So this is all, I definitely did not know the connection to this campus. So this is still all brand new, right?